Welcome to the Charlevoix Stories Project, a continuation of the Charlevoix oral tradition. Today is Thursday, September 15th, and we are at the Charlevoix Public Library. My name is David Miles. I'm a curator at the Charlevoix Historical Society, and I am very pleased to introduce to you Myrl Keller, who was a former employee and official of the Charlevoix Research Stations, the Great Lakes Research Station that was based here in the old fish hatchery. Well, welcome, Myrl. Thank you for coming here today to talk to us. What was your actual title here at the Charlevoix Fisheries Station?
I was in charge of the fisheries station, which was acquired from the Bureau of Fisheries, Federal, in 1967. We set it up, and it was to evaluate programs, the introduction of the salmon, brown trout, lake trout, and all the species in Lake Michigan.
Mm-hmm. And your official educational title is biologist?
I'm a fisheries biologist by training, yes.
Where did you get your education?
Michigan State University.
I think you told me that the Charlevoix Fisheries Station was the first one on the Great Lakes?
It was the first research station, yes, that was set up in the 60s, primarily to evaluate the species we were introducing. And later, there were stations set up in Alpena, Marquette for Lake Superior, and down on Lake St. Clair.
And the fisheries research took over from the Fish and Wildlife Service?
Well, historically, Michigan didn't do any work on the Great Lakes whatsoever, other than law enforcement and some spot research. Most of it was done with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They had an agreement that they would do the research and the state would do the management, and it was primarily around the commercial fishery.
I see.
There wasn't really any sport fishery. Commercial fishing started in the Great Lakes in the mid 1800s and went on more or less as a free-for-all for 100 years. And then the stocks started to decline.
In the 1920s?
In about the 1920s, as early as that, in the 30s. Mm-hmm. And by the 50s, it was pretty sad.
Yes, I remember that. The fish hatchery that was built here down on the Lake Michigan beach went up in 1917, and we discovered, reading the microfilms of the local paper, that it was at the time the largest federal fish hatchery in the United States, which I was very surprised to find out about. Well, let's backtrack a little bit here. Where did you originate? Where did you come from?
I came from the Saginaw Bay area, the son of a commercial fishing family on both sides. Mm-hmm. My mother's father had, I think, one of the largest commercial fisheries on the Great Lakes. And also my stepfather fished, and I fished with him because at that time in the 50s, the fishing wasn't that good and he couldn't afford to hire another man. So after school and weekends, I fished for 2 or 3 years with him before I went into the service.
What was the port that they worked out of?
The port that we fished out of was Seaboyne, and the port that my family, or my mother's family, fished out of was Bayport.
Bayport. And then after you graduated high school, then you went to Michigan State.
I went in the service first.
You went in the service first. You were associated with a very famous American man when you were in the service.
Yes, I was. I was fortunate to go to Antarctica with Admiral Byrd.
What was he like?
Oh, wonderful person. He wasn't really a military person. He just was more of an explorer. And he was just the most wonderful person to sit down and talk about things. He wore a suit made out of caribou that he had gone to the North Pole also, that an Indian guide had made for him. And he would talk about many things like that. In fact, after we got back, Boston was our home port. He invited us, 3 of us from Michigan, up to his house, and he died shortly after that.
So he was world famous by the time you became under his command.
Oh, definitely. They didn't think they could go into Antarctica without Byrd.
Really?
Because he had been there and he knew the seasons. And we went into, actually it was 1955 and 56, to set up the base sites, Little America 5 and McMurdo Sound, for the next geophysical year, where all the countries were going to participate in exploring Antarctica.
Right.
Oh, and his son went along with us, and he wrote stories about his father, where he was, what he'd done, and so on.
So you came back from that, and then you left the Navy, obviously. Then you went to Michigan State.
Went to Michigan State.
And your first job out of college was?
My first job was on sea lamprey control up in Marquette. It was a temporary job, and worked up there on sea lamprey control for, I guess it was, maybe 6 months. And then there was a permanent job came about in Ohio, and so I went down to Ohio and worked on Lake Erie for 2 years. And before I had graduated in summers, I worked for Michigan DNR, Lake and Stream Improvement. And they had wanted me to come to work for them after college. But a few days before I was to accept a job, no money, and they abolished the job. So I had to kind of scratch a little bit and get something going. So I worked those others. But they said they had a job, and it was going to be associated with Great Lakes, with the new introduction of salmon and other species. And so I went to work in Lansing first for 2 years. And then when this, actually, I was the one that promoted Charlevoix. We hauled fish out of here, lake trout, on one of the patrol boats, PB2, law enforcement boat. And we planned them off on the Fox Islands and west of the Beavers. And there was a man in there by the name of Gene Mason, who was a federal employee over the Charlevoix Hatchery and the Jordan River Hatchery. And since they had built the new Jordan River Hatchery, they were going to dispose of the Charlevoix. So I got wind of that and said, oh boy, this would be just a super place for a Great Lakes station. So that's how it started.
I see. You mentioned the PT boat 2. PT1, I believe, went out of service in '59. And I read in the Charlevoix Courier that over its law enforcement years, it was one of the most successful for trying to keep the illicit fishing from our neighboring states from crossing over into our waters. That by the time they got done, the amount of netting that they had confiscated would have stretched from Chicago to the Straits of Mackinac. It was an amazing statistic. So that boat was really worth its weight in gold in keeping our fish stocks, hopefully, away from the illegal fishing coming out of Wisconsin, Indiana, and Illinois.
Our survey boat, the one that I had built, the Steelhead that's docked here in Charlevoix, had some of those assignments also. I remember in January one year, Wisconsin fishermen were fishing over in our waters in Green Bay, and we took off, and snowstorm, went across the lake and pulled a few of their nets, and that stopped them. But talking about gill nets, in 1965, when we were introducing the salmon and brown trout and lake trout, there was enough gill net fished in the Great Lakes system, that's all the Great Lakes, that would have gone around the world almost 3 times, to give you an idea of the multitude of net. Well, the gill net is not a selective piece of gear. Whatever swims into it, if they're large enough, they'll get in the net and gill. The smaller fish will gill by their teeth. And so we were real concerned when we were introducing all these new species, trying to rehabilitate the lake trout and the salmon, the steelhead, the brown trout, and so on. So we monitored the commercial fishery on a regular basis and found that it was very detrimental to many of these species. So in 1970, we banned the large mesh gill net, the commercial fishery. I wasn't too popular here in Charlevoix.
I remember.
Because Charlevoix was a major port in the commercial fish industry.
Well, to give a little bit of history about what happened here, here is a statistic that I found incredible. This came from a report that was sent to the United States Commission of Fish and Fisheries, report of the commissioner for 1887 in Washington, D.C. And in the entry regarding Charlevoix, this is a quote: "As early as 1866, 3 gangs of gill net fishermen with 75 nets to a boat began operations at Charlevoix. In 1885, there were 2,826 nets in the water, having a total length of 606,900 feet, the average length being about 35 fathoms, which is 210 feet deep. They cost about $6.50 each. The steamers have no regular fishing grounds, but set their nets wherever the fish happen to be," unquote. And so you can start to realize even back then the decimation of the fish stock that took place in the Great Lakes.
That was the big problem. Very little enforcement. And then when you consider Lake Michigan, you should treat it like a big pasture. Wisconsin fishermen fish in that pasture, Michigan, Illinois, Indiana. And to get regulations uniform across the lake was very difficult. It was always one state or the other had smaller size limits or smaller mesh in their nets and so on. So it was difficult until about the 60s when we saw that everything, the lake trout were depleted. 6 of the 7 species of chubs were extinct. Whitefish was at very low levels. Yellow perch were at low levels, and all the commercial species were at low levels. So, and the lake was literally full of alewife. Alewife was an invader up through the St. Lawrence Seaway from the ocean. And alewife at that time comprised almost 90% of the weight of fish in Lake Michigan. So our goal was that we had to introduce a predator. The federal people came on pretty strong that they wanted to create an industrial fishery. And it did start in Wisconsin to some extent, where they would harvest these alewife in large quantities and put them in a meal plant and use them for cattle feed, the dry product. We said no. We want to introduce something that will prey on that, feed on that base, something that is economically good for the state of Michigan, something that will start a sport fishery, because through a sport fishery, the fish in the lake are public. They're owned by the public. It would give more public benefit. So that's when we started the salmon program. And that's how the Charlevoix Fish Hatchery became the Great Lakes Fisheries Station. And we went on from there. What's
the difference between a coho and a Chinook?
The coho is a Pacific salmon, same as the Chinook. Their lifespan is 3 years. The Chinook is 4 years. Chinook gets much larger than the coho, and it's really preferred by the sport fishery. They are something spectacular. You catch them on a line, and the first thing that rod going off is zhizh, 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 zhizh. They'll take off 100 yards of line, and they're really fun, and they're excellent eating.
Do they have to continually be restocked, or are they reproducing to the subsistence level now?
I set up studies from the station on reproduction of the Chinook, and we marked them. We'd clip the adipose fin, that's the fleshy fin behind the tail, and that marked that they had a microtag in their nose, and that microtag was about the size of a 1 on a penny. And if that adipose was clipped, we'd take and cut that little fleshy part of the nose off, take it back to the lab and analyze it. Beyond that, we fed them tetracycline, antibiotic, and it would leave a ring on their bony vertebrae. So we could tell, okay, if they're, and also they were all fin clipped. So those that were recovered, if they had a fin clip, they might have a microtag in their nose, or if we examined a vertebrae, they had a circle, we knew that they were hatchery raised fish. Probably after 5 to 7 years, we started noticing natural reproduction. And when I retired in 1996, there was as much as 40% from natural reproduction.
Your goal is 100% or as close as you can get to it?
Well, we didn't need that because right now, actually, the level of planting and natural reproduction of the 5 species that we worked with, lake trout, Chinook, coho, brown trout, and steelhead, have reduced that alewife to the point that now it's becoming very scarce.
Good.
So we're cutting back on all of the plantings, and hopefully so we can get an equilibrium between the predator and the prey.
Well, I remember the years when the alewife was so prevalent that they would wash up on the beach north of the pier, north of the North Pier, all the way to North Point and rot. And the stench that would come over the town. You couldn't walk on the beach because the stench was so strong. And it was like this silver, rotting silver carpet in the middle of the beach all the way out there. So that was probably when it was at its worst.
1967.
It could have been then, yeah.
Wind rode on the beach, the full length Lake Michigan, some places 3 feet deep. And that's the reason that we introduced the predators to reduce that alewife. I used to get so nervous because about June in the spring, they'd start dying. See, the alewife would go to the very deepest waters in the winter months because they were the warmest. And that put a stress on them. And when they were so abundant, they would start dying then. But I'd ask Joe Phillips, could he give me a report flying over to the beavers,
Right.
how much floating dead alewife were out there. So I had a little bit of forecast for the newspapers, and all the people started inquiring.
You didn't mention the whitefish in that list of 5. Are the whitefish self-sustaining? Are they?
The whitefish were initially hatchery produced, but they found that the way they raised them just to a small fry, there wasn't a lot of success. And they've done pretty well on their own, except for when they were overfished to begin with, and then the sea lamprey came in and cropped them down. But once sea lamprey became under control to a certain level, and that would have been about the 60s also, whitefish started to pick up in numbers. But whitefish are a bottom feeder. They feed on little zooplankton, as we call it, organisms off the bottom. They're not a predator on other fish. So that's why I didn't speak about them.
Okay.
Chubs were the same.
Well, somebody told me that The stock of whitefish in northern Michigan is probably right at its very best right now. Is that true?
It's been up there for a few years, but it's up and down. Much of it depending on how the spawning takes place. The weather's a big factor. I think there's regulations in place, although we don't have any regulation on the treaty fishermen that are a new player in the Great Lakes system.
Right.
Yeah, they're up there. I think the production's probably around 5 million pounds now out of Lake Michigan and Green Bay.
That sounds pretty healthy.
That's good.
We came across a statistic at the Historical Society that when the first missionaries arrived in this area, they reported that fish on average weighed between 60 and 70 pounds. That's what the Indians were catching. By 1900, the average was down to 30. So that is what overfishing caused, and you can see the slide there. Charlevoix had a major role in the fishing industry on Lake Michigan. Booth Fisheries, which was one of the biggest fish merchants in the country, was based in Chicago. And their main branch for northern Michigan was in Petoskey, and they had a subsidiary branch here in Charlevoix. Well, they realized because we were so close to the railroad line that came through town and the maritime lines, Petoskey had that distance of Little Traverse Bay, that was not in its favor, that in 1908, Booth transferred everything from Petoskey here, and up to that time, Petoskey had been handling up to 3 million pounds of fish annually. So by bringing the entire storage plant here to Charlevoix, combined with what we already had, that at one time during the year, that freezing capacity could hold itself 1 million pounds of fish. And that move made Charlevoix the largest fish exporting port on the Great Lakes. I don't know if you ever knew that or not.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
I think when you talked about the missionary folks, when they talked about 60-pound fish, that could only be maybe sturgeon. Lake trout, yeah, there was one taking 50 pounds, I think, in Lake Superior. But that would be a little large for the others.
So maybe it was the sturgeon, which I remember ones were very, very prevalent.
Sturgeon were very, very abundant. In fact, fishermen would harvest them and stockpile them on the beach and burn them because they were detrimental to their fishing gear, historically.
Wow.
Yeah.
I know I read that when the first explorers came to this continent, on northern Long Island Sound, on the south shore of Connecticut, the lobster was so prevalent that you could walk on them, and they hauled them in and threw them inland for fertilizer.
Well, that's similar to lake sturgeon, yeah. And the lake sturgeon's a wonderful eating fish, and the roe today is worth a lot of money. And because they're late in life spawners, it was pretty easy to get rid of them. Harvested them off. They apparently didn't have any market, and burned them on the beach so they wouldn't ruin their nets.
And you can understand now why the Indians literally stood on the sidelines and wept at what the white man was doing to their fish, to their forests, coming in and just wiping them out for the dollar.
First 100 years, from the mid-1800s up to the 1940s, that was pretty much the case.
And then fortunately
there was
we
very
woke up.
little sport fishing and a very, very overcapitalized
Right.
commercial fishery on all the lakes, all of the Great Lakes, not only Lake Michigan, but Lake Huron, Lake Erie, Lake Superior.
Well, one more statistics before we get back to our questions. Right here in Charlevoix, we contributed enormously to the decimation of the fish because the John O'Neill fishery, which is on the north shore of Round Lake, right about just beyond the Edgewater, In 1902, it was reported that O'Neill had employed 15 people over the winter to make 544 new nets. They totaled 85 miles when they were set in the water. Now, combined with the nets that were still usable, that year, O'Neill set out 125 miles of netting from 3 tugs alone in northern Lake Michigan. And that is the equivalent of 2 round trips between Charlevoix and St. James. By 1908, he had 75 people in Charlevoix making and mending nets. So the mileage must have gone well up from that 125 after that. So you can just see what happened because of that.
And David, the big problem also, when they fished that amount of net, they would figure on lifting 3 nights, let them out 3 nights, 2 nights. But if they had a big northwest blow, they couldn't get to them for maybe as much as 8 days, 9 days. Those fish laid gilled in those nets dead. And what do you think they brought back to shore as for a product to eat? And I've been told that that's kind of how smoking fish got started. That if they were a little soft and raggedy, throw them in the brine, throw them in a smokehouse, they could sell them.
Really? Even though they were starting to go a little bit bad?
Yes.
Really?
Yes. I was told this. I don't know. I've never experienced that. But I've been around commercial fishermen all my life and dealt with them, and I love them. And that's why I went into this profession, was because my families were commercial fishermen, and I wanted to contribute and help them see the good days again. But
okay.
They didn't help themselves well, and the government certainly didn't help them well. The legislature, they had a strong lobby, and they could pretty much do and fish the way they wanted. The cost to go fishing, I think, was $1.50 a foot for the boat, was the license fee. So it was relatively cheap. Gill nets were easy to fish. And so that's how so many people got involved. And in the 60s, we saw this, that they were so overcapitalized. And it was difficult for me here in Charlevoix, because there were a lot of families here in Charlevoix. Mm-hmm. And, but something had to happen to bring the fish back. In fact, my uncles who ran my mother's company in Bayport would pound on her table and say, "You're taking the money off your mother's table." And so I came up with, what's best for the fish is best for the fishermen, whoever they may be. And that seemed to help a little.
Good. So it was also in the mid-60s that the Great Lakes states themselves got together, combined with the tribal councils, and began working on a plan to bring this back. Is that true?
Yeah, it was actually primarily because of the sea lamprey that all of the states had to pull together to combat the sea lamprey, and also the province of Ontario, which shares the other side of the lakes. So they set up the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission in 1955 to act as a forum for the states to report, do the research and report, and also kill sea lamprey. That cost today is like $30 million annually. They treat them in the stream with a chemical called TFM, and also another chemical in the mouths of streams where they're in deeper water, with a chemical called Bayer 73. I don't know if I should get into the life history of the sea lamprey, but it's kind of interesting. If you'd like, I'll tell you just in short.
Okay.
The sea lamprey is parasitic in the Great Lakes First it came up the Welland Canal into the Great Lakes, and it was at its peak. It started in the 30s, and it was at its peak by the 50s.
So this originated in saltwater in the ocean?
Originated in saltwater, was first in Lake Ontario, and then came through the Welland Canal. It's one of the exotics, and there's been over 100 exotics come into the Great Lakes since the Welland Canal was opened up. And in the ballast of ships, that's another story, but let me tell you a little life history of the sea lamprey. It's adult in the lake for a year and a half, and they figure that it feeds on the blood and flesh of fish, primarily lake trout and whitefish, and the larger chubs and salmon. It then goes up into a stream like a trout, fans out a red, is called a red, which is a bed in the gravelly material, deposits its eggs. They stay there as much as 7 years, and then they hatch out and come downstream, and they hatch within the next spring, come down as amniocetes, a small sea lamprey, not parasitic, embed in the bank of the stream they're in. They're in there for as much as 7 years. Then go down out of the stream and are out into the Great Lakes system. That's the cycle. So that's why they treated chemically over in Rogers City at Hammond Bay. Dr. Vern Applegate went through 6,000 chemicals before he found this TFM, trimethylfluoral nitrophenol. That would kill sea lamprey and not the other organisms in the stream.
How large can a sea lamprey grow?
Sea lamprey will grow, they're probably average 18 inches, maybe a little over that in length.
Okay. Is there any prospect of ever completely wiping them out?
We thought it was under pretty good control. But then on the other hand, through the water regulations and water quality regulations, we've made so many streams more conducive for them. They have to have a clear crystal stream, like a brook trout, to spawn in. So we extended it, and then the St. Mary's River became another big hatching place. So it's been most difficult. They've done a wonderful job. They've kept them under pretty good control.
Yes, they have.
But to eliminate them entirely, I doubt it.
Okay.
They also have experimented with sterilizing males and putting them into the population.
You mentioned a slogan that was thought up called Fish for All.
Yes.
Could you talk about that?
It's a book, and I've given it to
Oh,
Judith.
that's right, it is.
Here's the book. It was written by a couple professors from Western Michigan University. And it's quite interesting. It gives a lot of history of the Great Lakes. It's interviewed people, fishermen, biologists, administrators, university, tribal fishermen. And in fact, here's Jackie Cross and his son.
Really? From Charlevoix, yeah.
From Charlevoix that they interviewed.
So anybody who wants to know the history of the fishing industry in the Great Lakes, especially Michigan, this is the book that they should come to.
I think this is the most up-to-date.
Okay.
If you want to go to history, there's many publications out there that you could read. But to get the different opinions of all the users and researchers on the Great Lakes, that's a good book. It's going to be available here through your library.
Okay, good to know. Did you ever have occasion to work with the State of Michigan Conservation Department vessels? Have anything to do with illegal fishing, or was that out of your venue? Or did they come to you for any kind of advice?
Oh no, we worked with them. In fact, the first year at Charlevoix, we used the patrol boat that was stationed here in Charlevoix, PB2, as our survey vessel for the first season. And then that was 1967, and then 1968, the steelhead that we had built, and I had a big part laying it all out. And we hired Cappy Byers, the University of Michigan, a naval architect, to lay out the bottom on it. And but on law enforcement, we helped all we could in all areas. In fact, when the tribal fishery first started, they were all over the place, and we thought we could enforce them. But later in court, Judge Fox ruled that they may fish in seeded waters where fish may be found. That was awful broad. They could have fished Lake Charlevoix or any stream. Enforcement just from the state then was gone on that respect, and they had their own enforcement people.
Are the Native Americans becoming more ecologically conscious, realizing they have to cooperate in order to keep the fish stocks up for everybody?
Yes, they are.
Good.
They have their own biologists, they have their own surveys, but they cooperate with the various states. And through the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, we report annually, and they're part of that, which is very important.
Now, according to an article we have at the Historical Society, the Steelhead was designed to be the first fisheries survey vessel of the Michigan Department of Conservation, specifically for surveying.
Yes, the Steelhead was the first, although they did use some of the Patrol Boat 1 way back, did studies, and so actually it was used too. And the other patrol boats, they had one on each lake, one on Michigan, one on Huron, one on Superior. And they used to rotate, so the patrol boat officers would get too friendly with the commercial fishermen.
So the Steelhead actually was designed specifically for surveying.
The first one to do fisheries work, evaluate fisheries, yes.
And I believe it was responsible for Lake Michigan, Huron, and Superior.
Initially.
Now only it's Lake Michigan.
Now it's just Lake Michigan.
And Charlevoix is still her home base.
Charlevoix is the home base, yes.
And you can see her on the upper channel, right next to the Coast Guard station.
Right.
Yeah, it's always nice to go around the corner and seeing her back in her booth. With the records that had been kept, and you received orders from Minnesota to destroy them at the hatchery.
Well, when we took over the Charlevoix Fish Hatchery, and I mean the Department of Natural Resources, there was a gentleman there by the name of Gene Mason, I had mentioned him, who was in charge of that hatchery in the Jordan River. And he was the one that got the orders out of their regional headquarters in Minneapolis to destroy all records of past records of the Charlevoix hatchery. Just made me sick.
Was there a reason for it?
I don't know. He did not give me one. He did give me a diary by Elijah Gear, who is a Charlevoix family. He was superintendent of the hatchery at one time. And in his diary, he had where they took the fry and planted them on the reefs. This was most beneficial to not only our operation, but the commissions and others. They knew then, because where the eggs were taken off whatever reef, they normally took and planted that fry back on that reef. The planting of the fry was not a real successful program, but at least that was the early attempts to try to rehabilitate and build up the fish stocks.
Mm-hmm. So we lost an enormous amount of historical data from this, because we could have known where they were taken, when they were taken, how much was taken. Do you have any ballpark figure, perhaps, of how many fish went out of the Charlevoix hatchery to do stocking of the lakes? It had to have been in the billions by the time they...
It was in the millions every year. Of course, you got to remember that they brought the eggs in. The fishermen were issued a permit to go in the spawning season, normally November, for lake trout and whitefish, and they'd go on the reefs and they'd catch the spawning fish. They'd strip the eggs out of the female, melt out of the male in a dish, stir them up, put a little water on them, let them set, and then they were water hardened. Put them in cream cans, bring them into the hatchery, and then the hatchery would take and develop them from that point. There were literally millions of fry, what they were called fry. In the hatchery, they would develop, they'd get them in the fall, develop through the winter, they would hatch, they'd have a yolk sac yet on their belly, and when that was dissolved pretty much in their system, that was about the time to plant them. An interesting thing that I did get from some of the old fishermen was that in those days, that it was a late winter here in Charlevoix, and they couldn't get the boat out to plant the fry. They would take them to lakes like Torch Lake, Burt Lake, Mullet Lake, Crystal Lake, and plant them, whitefish. And that was interesting because I suspect that's how many of those lakes had built their whitefish population.
The Charlevoix hatchery, did it become outdated? Is that why they built the one down in the Jordan Valley?
Yes, it became outdated, and it didn't have the volume of water necessary to raise fish up to, like the lake trout today when they're planted, are 6 to 8 inches long. They didn't have the water volume. They used the old city well and had as much as 3 pumps going at a time, and it would produce about, I think it was 500 gallons a minute. So it was outdated, and the bell jar system was outdated. Today, they hatch in what they call a Heath incubator. It's a column of drawers. They put the eggs in there, and the water trickles through, and they use that. Much more efficient.
Well, you mentioned the water, and the city well was right there next to the hatchery.
There were 2 wells, yes.
2 wells, yes.
Yes.
When I was a kid, one of my fondest memories of my childhood was I lived a block from Lake Michigan Beach. So I was down there all the time. And in the summertime when it was so hot, and we were down there and we were trying to cool off by going in the lake, and then of course you come back and you get hotter again. But we would just walk into the hatchery. There was no security, nothing, and it was like cooling off at immediately 20 degrees. And you had this constant hissing sound because the faucets were on all the tanks, keeping the water in motion. And we go up and down those aisles looking at that fish, and we'd keep an eye out for the guys who worked there. And if they weren't looking, we'd dip our fingers in and we'd swirl the water and make the fish swim around in circles.
I had that same pleasure for about 10 years. We raised fish there because we were building our new hatchery system. Didn't have capacity, so we used this hatchery. We raised Chinook, coho, steelhead, even some lake trout. So that natural air-conditioned water going through that system was wonderful.
Yeah, it was.
And when they shut it down, it wasn't quite so nice in the hot summers.
Oh, I can imagine. A couple of years ago, there was an enormous shortage of whitefish because we had such a hot summer. And the fish retreated to the bottom of the lake out of reach of the nets. And, well, whitefish became a gourmet item here. You paid through the nose if they even were able to get it in the local restaurants. And I know the Crosses were really upset because they're major distributors here for about 25 different restaurants. And all of a sudden we had no more whitefish. And Charlevoix with whitefish is just, you can't even think about the possibility, but it happened. So what do you think long-range global warming, which is more a probability than a possibility, how is that going to affect the fish stocks? Or are we just going to have to build longer nets?
No, we don't want to build longer nets. There's plenty of nets now. It could have effect on some species, but these lakes are called oligotrophic, cold, deep, not as productive as the shallower lakes. And I think that cold temperature will maintain, and it's going to take a lot of years of global warming to make a big change in the system.
Okay.
I think when at times we get ice cover almost over the entire lake. And when we start losing that, I'd start getting nervous.
Well, the last few years we've been sort of getting back to the normal of what we had before. The lake level's coming back up. They've maintained their coldness. So what do you think personally is your greatest contribution to maintaining the health of the Great Lakes fisheries? What are you most proud of what you've done?
Well, my work was setting up and training the people initially at Charlevoix, designing the gear, setting up the stations, working with all of the users of the fisheries. And I think I did a good job, and others must have also, because in 2002, they put me in the National Fishing Hall of Fame, which is quite an honor because there are people in there like Isaac Walton. Well, actually, there were 200 people in there worldwide when they put me in.
That is an enormous
Enshrined
honor.
for life. From the state of Michigan, Dr. Tanner is there, Dr. Toady, Dr. Ball, who was a limnologist, John Dingler, a legislator, is in there because of the Dingell-Johnson bill that taxed fishing tackle, and then that money came back to the states for work on fisheries. And many other really important people. How I got in there, David, I don't know, but I feel good about it.
That's a question you don't want to ask, because somebody probably praised you to the skies, and the reputation of your work preceded you. Yes, you do have an artifact with you.
Oh, I
that
have
he
an
wants to see.
artifact that if the Hersha House would like that, because this was the basis of the first hatchery in Charlevoix, the Charlevoix Hatchery. This was the basis of their operation, and it's called a bell jar, and it's extremely rare. Now, I happened to pick this up when I worked for the state of Ohio on Put-in Bay, South Bass Island, and they told me, Ernie Miller, who was the superintendent there, told me that this had come from Charlevoix. It was coincidental that I wound up working here. But this is called a bell jar, and they're set up in racks and batteries. And what they do, there were literally thousands in the Charlevoix Fishery Hatchery. And it's set up in big batteries, maybe 4 or 5 high, in rows. And down in the center of this is a pipe with water, and they put the eggs in here, the whitefish eggs and the lake trout eggs, and they just roll around easy with that water, keeping movement. And then when they hatch out, they'll swim up, spill over this spout into a trough, and then swim down into the tanks.
So that's how they get into the trough.
That's how they got in. This is one of the this has got to be over 100 years old.
Oh my.
I've seen them in our hatchery, in the state hatchery, with a metal rim around it and the spout, and I've seen them fiberglass, but this is one of the originals. And I'd like to give this to you for your museum if you'd like it.
Yeah, absolutely. Ask me a hard question, yes. That's thrilling.
Because they were used here in Charlevoix. That's the initial hatchery for whitefish and trout. Later, they redid the hatchery. I'd say it was in the 50s. And then started raising a few lake trout in the tanks. They built tanks. But they would hire quite a few people, I guess, in Charlevoix to work that hatchery in the season. It would be during the winter months. The eggs that would die would be white or opaque, and they'd have to remove those. They'd stick a feather down in there and stir them a little bit, and pick off the dead eggs. And that was a continuous job, going from one jar to another, And
That is priceless.
but that is a bell jar from a bell jar hatchery, and I wish you'd continue and maybe talk to the people at the Jordan River Hatchery. Maybe some of those records from Charlevoix went there.
Okay.
And get a
We'll
good
see.
history on
Well,
that.
thank you so much. I had no
welcome.
idea this was going to end on such a high note, so,
Yeah. That's well-aged glass. It's
yeah,
starting to turn blue.
yeah. Okay, Myrl, thank you so much for coming
You bet,
today.
David. My pleasure.
This is going to be invaluable for our historical record.